Chapter 14. Cancer Cures. I deal in this book only briefly with cancer cures, because cancers sometimes do go into remission, and because nearly all cases that have medical documentation have it because the patient underwent medical treatment. This is as it should be. It would be unethical to have patients under medical observation while withholding available treatment that might prove beneficial. At the same time, spontaneous cures of most kinds of cancer are quite rare if the cancer has metastasized, that is, if it has spread to other organs. Some of the following cases, such as that of Lisa Larios, those of the Lourdes records, the pancreatic cases, and in the following chapter, that of Ruth Lindbergh, are stronger than some others, for which fewer records are available, such as that of William Burton. All are, however, merely samples of the many reports of cancer healing today. Healing testimonies are frequent enough that even an older friend of mine from the church small group that meets in my home celebrated one recently, although the healing happened during an early stage of cancer. Cancer in earlier times. The Gospels reports of healings that witnesses see and hear, Matthew chapter 11 verses 4 through 5, Luke chapter 7 verse 22, do not specify cancer healings for natural reasons. First, most internal cancers are not visible. Second, ancient Galileans probably thought more in terms of symptoms, such as skin growths or inability to walk, than in terms of the diseases that we label cancer today. Although a Greek medical term related to cancer existed, it was not likely known to ordinary Galileans. Third, osteoarchaeologists have surveyed ancient bones and argued that cancer was much less common before the 16th century. Today it is the leading cause of death next to heart disease. Many medical historians believe that it was much rarer in antiquity. Although cancer might not have been identified as such in antiquity, it was certainly widespread and greatly feared in much of the 20th century. Examples of reported cures could be multiplied, but one will suffice here. Historian David Emmett shared with me information about British missionary William Burton, some of whose reports about other miracles appeared in my previous miracles book. Enough correspondence from Burton's circle survives to inspire confidence that he was expected to die, barring a miracle. Burton, who was serving in Congo, doubled over with abdominal pains in February 1944. Burton noted that barium X-rays showed his colon to be seriously obstructed, with waste backing up. Further X-rays in a Johannesburg hospital revealed the rapid development of growths in his colon, and in May, doctors performed a cecostomy to drain waste products. They informed Burton's wife that cancer had spread throughout his colon and gave him a maximum of 6 months to live. Burton reports the verdict of the hospital register. Mr. Burton was discharged from the hospital at his own request in a dying condition. Enough correspondence survives to underline the seriousness of these expectations. In various letters to friends, Burton noted the doctor's assessment that he had less than a year to live. Nevertheless, he expressed hope that God would hear the prayers of Congolese believers and enable his ministry to continue. He continued to wear a cup and rubber bag to receive the waste products from his body. 6 months after his operation, in January 1945, he returned to his ministry in Congo. A public prayer request soon after noted that he was expected to die in June. His fellow missionaries grew increasingly concerned, and by May, a colleague noted both his weakness and his extreme pain, while another prayer request recounted that he was very frail and thin. Soon after this, however, he began to improve. In July, he reported that 15 months after his diagnosis, his bowel and bladder were functioning normally. He reported that he was examined again in May 1946 in a hospital in Luanshya, northern Rhodesia, now Zambia. There, further X-ray examination revealed no evidence at all of cancer. He reported that the physicians in Johannesburg deemed his recovery miraculous, and he preserved 2 sample X-rays, one from the beginning of his condition and one from after his recovery. Although these 2 surviving X-ray images are not by themselves sufficient to say more today than that his colon was severely impaired in the former picture and healthy in the latter one, the surgeries to place and close the ostomy should have allowed his doctors to make correct assessments. Burton returned to his full schedule and lived until 1971, dying at the age of about 85 after decades of effective ministry in Congo, where he reported many miracles, most faster than this one. Metastasized cancer of the hip. By May 1972, 12-year-old Lisa Larios could no longer walk, and tests showed that she was dying from cancer, more specifically, reticulum cell sarcoma of the right pelvic bone. By the time doctors discovered the hip socket tumor, a physician notes, it had already invaded the soft tissues of the interior of the pelvis. Multiple doctors confirmed the diagnosis. Because the cancer had spread so far, doctors grimly warned Lisa's parents that even amputation from the hip down could no longer save her. Although Lisa was expected to live only 6 more months, her parents had not yet informed her that her condition was terminal. Instead, they took her on various trips, hoping that she could enjoy her remaining months of life. A neighbor insisted on taking Lisa to a healing meeting, but Lisa's mother, Isabel, was reluctant. Lisa still did not know how sick she was. If they took her to such a meeting, would it frighten her? Although the family was Catholic, they had not even considered the possibility of a miracle. Lisa's father, Javier, however, suggested that they had nothing to lose. So Isabel brought Lisa on July 16th. During the time of prayer for healing, the minister called out that someone in Lisa's section was being healed of cancer. Isabel did not think this was a good time to inform Lisa that she had cancer. Lisa, however, experienced a warm sensation in her stomach. Feeling an overwhelming urge, she abruptly stood up. Then she began to walk up and down the aisle, because she could. Isabel was stunned. The doctor had warned her not to let Lisa put any pressure on the hip bone. Her hip is just like butter, he had explained. Lisa still did not know about the cancer, but she knew that she was now able to walk, and she went up on stage with her neighbor. The minister, unaware that there was no hip bone, urged, "Run, honey," and Lisa ran back and forth across the stage. Isabel still did not know what to make of it, and did not want her daughter to have false hope. Nevertheless, they left the auditorium with Lisa walking. When they reached home, Lisa started riding her bike, and Javier realized that she had been healed. Isabel remained more cautious, deciding to wait for the medical results. The medical results took a little while. The doctors at the hospital were initially confused and gave Lisa every test possible, consulting with more and more physicians. Not only was the cancer gone, but the bone damage that the cancer had caused was gone, a restoration that was impossible naturally. Richard Kasdorf, M.D., Ph.D., a widely published medical school professor, includes the before and after X-rays in his earlier mentioned book, The Miracles, A Medical Doctor Says Yes to Miracles. Lisa's recovery, then, could not have been only on a psychosomatic level, even if she had known the nature of her condition. After carefully examining the medical records, Dr. Kasdorf agreed to go on the Mike Douglas show with Lisa and her mother Isabel, equipped with Lisa's X-rays. After a meeting the night before in one of the hotel's dining rooms, they decided to return to their rooms on the 16th floor. Kasdorf attests that Lisa eagerly took the stairs all the way up. Although Kasdorf's accounts provide fairly extensive details regarding Lisa Larios' healing, reports of bone restoration after prayer are not unique to this case. For example, In another report, multiple spinal fractures that were evident on a CT scan were, after prayer, no longer evident on MRI reports soon afterward, even though the disease that originally led to the problem had to be treated medically. Another report concerns a 4-year-old with an inch-long hole in his skull where the bone had been eaten away by a tumor. 2 months later, not only was the tumor gone, but bone had grown and completely closed the cavity. Pancreatic cancers. Cancer of the pancreas is one of the deadliest cancers. Even with today's technology, depending on the stage at which the cancer is identified, usually late, the 1-year survival rate is 20%. The 5-year survival rate is 7%. On July 2, 2003, the Malar Hospital in Eskilstuna, Sweden, diagnosed Bengt Eriksson with stage 4 pancreatic cancer, for which the survival prognosis at the time was usually 3 to 6 months. Eriksson's pancreas itself contained a 4-centimeter tumor, but the cancer had also metastasized to the liver and blocked Eriksson's bile duct. Eriksson's doctors began palliative treatment, but warned that he probably would not survive until Christmas. The clogged bile duct turned Eriksson's skin yellow, and he developed itchy rashes. Because the palliative chemotherapy made him feel worse and was not meant to save his life in the long run anyway, after 6 weeks he refused further treatment. Because Eriksson was a well-respected leader in his local community, many people were praying for him: pastors, priests, neighbors, and other municipal politicians. Eriksson was called to the hospital after another CT scan. He went in expecting news of swelling because he had discontinued the chemotherapy treatment. Instead, he reports that his chief physician, Johan Raud, looked uncertain, showing him the plates. "There is no trace of the cancer now," Dr. Raud noted. "You know, Bengt, we doctors can't explain everything." The same, of course, is true for theologians, but sometimes the two forms of discourse can supplement each other. Eriksson wondered whether his doctors had misdiagnosed him, prescribing the nauseating chemotherapy unnecessarily, but the doctors maintained that the original diagnosis was clearly correct. One of the doctors who had treated him described the healing as a miracle. Dr. Raud noted that there was no medical explanation. Still, mysteries remain. A few years later, Eriksson's oldest daughter passed away from cancer. After her death, Eriksson was sure that she was in heaven, but he could not understand why she had died and he had been spared. Similarly, at the age of 75, John Margosian was diagnosed in 1984 with an inoperable pancreatic tumor, which had grown around the inferior vena cava and the abdominal aorta. Dr. Dennis Cope, the endocrinologist who first diagnosed Margosian, was a noted professor on the Faculty of Internal Medicine at UCLA. Cope notes that doctors treated Margosian with chemotherapy and radiation only to prevent further growth of the tumor. He was expected to die within 3 months. Many people, including inmates at the Chino prison where Margosian had ministered, were praying for him. Instead of being healed initially, Margosian contracted spinal meningitis, which was expected to kill him or leave him in a vegetative state. He fully recovered, however, and the doctors discovered that his tumor had disappeared. He returned to ministry in the prison and lived till age 91. Dr. Cope concluded that this was very definitely a miracle. There is no human explanation for what happened. Stage 4B Burkitt's lymphoma. Brian Wills knew what the Bible said about healing, and he had grown up in a church where he often witnessed healings. But his commitment to that belief was about to be sorely tested. Wills, who had been a skilled college athlete in Missouri, had since become an assistant coach at the University of Richmond. He seemed the epitome of health when sudden pains forced him to undergo medical testing. On February 6, 1987, his despondent doctor had to communicate unpleasant news. Brian has a mass in his abdomen the size of a golf ball, which has been diagnosed as Burkitt's lymphoma. Today, the survival prognosis for Burkitt's lymphoma is relatively high, but Wills's cancer was much further along than the cases usually diagnosed today, and it was growing rapidly. Only days after the initial diagnosis, Wills reports that the aggressive tumor was nearly 10 inches wide. This was not merely stage 4 cancer, but stage 4B. A specialist lamented, "I don't think there's anything I can do for you. You're too far gone." Wills continued to insist that God would heal him, but his cancer metastasized to most of his organs, and even he was shaken when a doctor predicted that he had fewer than 10 hours to live. Yet Wills felt that God spoke to him, instructing him to start by forgiving someone against whom he had harbored anger. A few hours after he did so, the night shift nurse noticed that his kidney had begun working again. He continued to improve, so the doctor tried a pre-dose of chemotherapy to see how his body would respond. Whether God used the pre-dose or not, something certainly happened in Wills's body. On February 20th, less than a month after his diagnosis, his doctor seemed confused. The radiologist report showed no evidence of cancer in any of his organs. The original tumor had completely disappeared. To lower the likelihood of recurrence, a doctor placed Wills and other patients on a harsh experimental regimen, which apparently only Wills survived. Whether God worked through, aside from, or in spite of this regimen, Wills has remained cancer-free. Brain tumors. Matthew John reports that he had a 6-centimeter brain tumor revealed by biopsies to be cancerous. It grew behind his left eye until he became mostly blind in that eye. An operation on December 1st, 1998, removed 2 centimeters of the tumor, but the rest was too deeply embedded. After a difficult month of radiation treatment, during which some of his vision returned, he returned to work. 6 months later, however, he felt compelled to leave his job and submit to God's different calling for him. As John prepared to board a flight to begin Bible training, his vision suddenly returned more fully, although an MRI shortly afterward showed that 4 centimeters of the tumor remained. John underwent training and carried on with ministry, and in June 2006, as John navigated another serious health crisis, MRIs revealed that barely any of the tumor remained. After 7-year-old Tim Nowak suffered an apparent stroke, a CT scan showed an egg-sized tumor on his brainstem. The next day, however, Tim's father, Dave, felt an uncanny assurance that God was taking care of the matter. The MRI that followed found no tumor, malignant or benign, leaving doctors scrambling to figure out what could have caused the stroke. A few days later, one physician confided to Dave, "I've looked at Tim's records, and this is a miracle." But she warned, "You're going to find resistance from the other doctors. They don't believe. They're trying to find something wrong." After 6 days of futile efforts, however, the staff recognized that nothing was wrong with Tim and sent him home. The Nowak's physician in Wyoming, where they moved, examined Tim's 40 pages of records from the previous hospital. This doctor, a Christian, concluded that a miracle had taken place. Since his new machine had not been tested yet, he offered to provide another CT scan. This time, the radiologist, though unaware of Tim's history, discerned apparent scar tissue in the location of the previous tumor. 10 years after the apparent stroke, Tim remains healthy and active. Some of my own friends report somewhat similar experiences, although without biopsies to prove malignancy, in some cases because surgery would have been too dangerous. Carol, a colleague at my previous institution, was diagnosed in fall 1998 with a brain tumor the size of a large cherry. After special prayer, the tumor began shrinking and disappeared entirely within about 8 months. A science professor I know has also shared his experience of healing from a brain tumor in writing. Stage 4 cancer in Ukraine. Frederick Onkai Taylor, a Ghanaian pastor in Vinnytsia, Ukraine, not only has theological training, but also is a medical doctor trained in the former Soviet Union. When his church prays for the sick, they require medical verification of a change in the condition prayed for before allowing persons healed to testify several months to a year later. Pastor Onkai Taylor acknowledges that not everyone prayed for gets healed, but he shared with me various accounts of healings from his church that he could verify on the basis of the documentation provided before testimonies were allowed. He reports the healing of tumors, cancers, endocrine disorders, mental disorders, and other conditions. For example, in 2002, he prayed for a woman from Russia with stage 4 metastatic cancer. She was unable to walk, but when he prayed for her, she walked, completely healed. She lived for 10 more years before dying from unrelated causes. Esophageal cancer in Minnesota. Minnesota Lutheran pastor Mark Matthews shared with me a number of accounts of healings from advanced stages of cancer. For example, Billy Halmay had advanced esophageal cancer, and doctors said there was nothing more they could do for him. He had stopped all treatment in hopes of an improved quality of life for his remaining days. When Mark prayed for him in April 2016, Billy and his wife Carol felt God's power. Billy's next CT scan, soon afterward, showed that the cancer had disappeared. His most recent CT scan, on September 10, 2020, continued to show no cancer, although he passed 2 months later from a stroke. Healings at Lourdes. Cancer healings have also taken place at Lourdes. A clear case of Hodgkin's disease was cured on May 31, 1950. The pilgrim who was healed felt warmth, and all traces of the disease were gone from his body. The original diagnosis of the disease cannot be disputed because the original histological specimens have been repeatedly and thoroughly reviewed. Repeated X-rays in July 1962 confirmed that a sarcoma had eaten away most of the left hemipelvis of Italian soldier Vittorio Micheli. Histological, radiological, and other evidence was certain. By November, the left leg was joined to the pelvis by a few sheaves of soft tissue, no bone. Not surprisingly, Micheli could not move the leg. He visited Lourdes on May 24, 1963, still requiring pain medicine and unable to walk. On June 1st, he was lowered into the bath and felt that he was healed. He was hungry immediately and did not need pain medicine anymore. Without pain, he began to walk with crutches, though the plaster cast doctors had earlier placed on his leg remained. In February 1964, when doctors removed the plaster cast, Micheli walked normally, still without pain. Subsequent X-rays showed that the bony reconstruction of the parts destroyed was progressing steadily, something that should not happen naturally. That is, his pelvic bone was regenerating. Despite faint scars, the tissue's restoration was even more complete than is usual in patients after surgical interventions. Many orthopedic surgeons were consulted who had dealt with bone cancer. None had encountered a case of spontaneous cure of a malignant tumor of the bone. 12-year-old Delizia Ciroli was dying from Ewing's sarcoma when she visited Lourdes for 4 days in August 1976. Unfortunately, no miracle occurred there, and after she returned to Sicily, her condition declined further. Her community continued to pray, however, and in December she started recovering. Her condition returned to and remained normal, with X-rays showing her bone repaired. On the basis of specimens from the original biopsy, multiple French experts on bone tumors confirmed the diagnosis of Ewing's sarcoma, for which spontaneous remissions were not known to occur. Lord Pilgrim Mademoiselle Delot's cancer was spreading, and physicians had given her up to die. At a point near death, she was instantly cured. Even her damaged organs regenerated properly. Similarly, an investigative reporter expresses his confidence in his interview of a woman who had been diagnosed as having an inoperable malignancy located between her pulmonary artery and her heart, and had been told she had 6 months to live. She was cured during her second time bathing in the water at Lourdes. She informed the reporter that about 60 cures had been reported in the half year before his visit. One case involved the instant healing of a man whose cancer had eaten away most of his hip bone, and she showed the reporter the X-rays confirming the full restoration of the bone. Doctors can treat many forms of cancer today, and spontaneous remissions are known to occur. They are sometimes estimated as happening in roughly 1 case out of 60,000, depending on the type of cancer. But at advanced stages, when cancer has spread throughout the body, cures are rarer than at earlier stages. Yet not only do we have random accounts of such cures, but often we see an accumulation of cases from particular circles. The aforementioned stories help illustrate what some Christians mean when they claim that God has healed them from cancer in ways beyond normal medical expectations. Chapter 15. Doctors Cured of Cancer. Psychiatrist Wanda Potowska had survived imprisonment in a Nazi concentration camp, only to discover in 1962 that she was dying of terminal cancer. Her doctor, a personal friend, hoped that surgery could add 2 or 3 years to her otherwise expected longevity of just 18 more months. Polish Bishop Karol Wojtyła, the future Pope John Paul II, meanwhile solicited prayer from a friend, Padre Pio, for this mother of 4 young girls. The operation found no tumor. For some time, Dr. Potowska, not inclined to supernatural explanations, simply assumed that she was among the 5% of cancer patients whose tumors were thought to disappear. In May 1967, however, she visited Padre Pio unannounced. He recognized her before she announced who she was. "Are you all right now?" he asked. By 1988, she had concluded that God had graciously healed her and had been patient about waiting for her to realize it. I focus this chapter, however, on the story of family physician Ruth Lindberg, which she has also made available online. Her blog during her ordeal, also available online, documents her emotions and prayers as she sought healing. In what follows, I condense and adapt her own words from the online version. Dismal diagnosis. Ruth became a follower of Jesus when she was a chemistry major at Loyola University, Chicago. She and her husband both became family physicians and chose to work especially among particularly needy people, first in an underserved area in Tennessee, and then for 4 years in Nepal. But in October 2013, when they were back in the U.S., Ruth began to have extreme abdominal pains. A CT scan revealed many abdominal masses and enlarged lymph nodes. Biopsies confirmed cancer, which was spreading so aggressively that her oncologist confessed that her survival appeared uncertain. She was 35 years old. After a month of concerted chemotherapy and prayer, a new CT scan revealed no cancer at all. A few months after Ruth completed chemotherapy, however, endometrial cancer, cancer of the uterus, was discovered, rare as this is among young women. The earlier cancer had apparently resurfaced in another organ. Despite successful surgery in November 2014, cancer again resurfaced in April 2015 this time near her lung. She laments, "This cancer would just not go away. We could not escape. I was scared, confused, and angry at God." This was not a localized cancer, but one that had metastasized. Moreover, each time cancer returns after an apparent remission, the odds of a permanent cure diminish. "As a physician," she recounts, "I knew what this recurrence meant for my prognosis. Hope was slipping away." One of Ruth's pastors felt assurance that she would be healed despite the medical evidence. Sometimes such insistence is merely denial, but the pastor remained adamant. "I sat there, numb and weary," Ruth confesses, yet reminded by her that all hope was not lost. God was still God. Despite her confusion, she reaffirmed her trust and asked for prayer again. The pastor and another friend anointed her with oil, prayed, and reaffirmed their sense that God had already heard their prayer. Yet Ruth knew too much about biochemistry and the normal prognosis for her stage of cancer to take their verdict on blind faith, so she quietly asked God for a special encouragement. A few days later, she read Jesus' promise in Luke chapter 11, verse 13, that God will give the Holy Spirit to those who ask Him. She cried out from the depths of her heart for a deeper experience of the Spirit. The Holy Spirit suddenly, unexpectedly knocked me to the ground. It's difficult to explain how it felt, other than that a force outside of myself flipped me onto my back. I had never had an experience like this before, but I immediately knew that this was the sign I had asked God for. Canceling cancer. Meanwhile, Ruth's doctors again proposed chemotherapy. Without explaining her experience to them, she requested another CT scan. She did not feel that she could refuse chemo without having some visible proof, for both my doctors and, to be honest, myself, that cancer was gone. Thus, in late May 2015, she had another CT scan, just a month and a half after the previous CT scan had revealed the cancer's recurrence. One need not be a radiologist to recognize the clear difference in the two scans, which are now available as a matter of public record. The cancer had vanished. My doctors could not explain what had happened, but were all in agreement that no treatment was now necessary, since there was nothing there to treat. Subsequent follow-up CT scans have confirmed the absence of cancer. Ruth emphasizes that Jesus, who healed throughout Galilee and Judea 2 millennia ago, is the same yesterday, today, and forever. In 2020, she advised me on several cases in this book. Part 4. The blind receive their sight, the lame walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear. Matthew chapter 11, verse 5, Luke chapter 7, verse 22. Jesus invited eyewitnesses to testify about what God was doing in His ministry. The blind receive sight, the disabled walk, the lepers are cleansed, the deaf hear, the dead are raised, and the poor are receiving the good news. Matthew chapter 11, verse 5, Luke chapter 7, verse 22. Why should we suppose that Jesus, now that He has all authority in heaven and on earth, Matthew chapter 28, verse 18, has become any less active where He is welcome? The following chapters treat some of the categories of cures that Jesus listed. Chapter 16. Do blind people still receive sight? Witnesses. Jesus invited eyewitnesses to testify about what God was doing in His ministry. Go and let John know what you have heard and seen. The blind receive sight. Matthew chapter 11, verses 4 through 5, Luke chapter 7, verse 22. All the earliest gospel accounts and sources about Jesus attest that He healed blindness, suggesting an accumulation of instances rather than a single case. Remarkable as this seems, such healings continue to be reported today. Earlier accounts. Some extra-biblical Christian accounts of healed blindness are very ancient. Augustine and Ambrose, for example, note a public healing of blindness in June 386. Such accounts continue throughout history, including in the skeptical 20th century. For example, a number of Anglican bishops around the world, including some who previously doubted that healing occurs today, testified to witnessing healings, including of blindness, when Anglican layman James Moore Hickson prayed. One eyewitness in Calcutta in 1921 reported, "I have seen the eyes of the blind opened immediately. One was an old man, one of a child 6 years of age born blind." A minister in China observed, "A hospital evangelist, whose eye has for years been unsuccessfully treated by the doctor, was practically healed before the man left the cathedral." Likewise, multiple witnesses and records attest the restored sight of a blinded, nearly destroyed eye associated with the ministry of Padre Pio in 1949. Writing half a century ago, one reporter criticized various faith healers of whom he was skeptical. Then, however, he noted more favorably how Dr. Henry Smith Leeper, previously Associate General Secretary of the World Council of Churches, was healed of a medically incurable eye disorder after a Presbyterian pastor laid hands on him. Nor are healings of blindness uncommon today, although it is sadly true that, at least in most of the world, most blind people who have prayed for healing are still blind. I have surveyed hundreds of reports of healed blindness, including accounts shared with me by eyewitnesses who saw eyes white from cataracts return to a normal color during their healing. Blindness healed in Africa. A friend, Dr. Bungishabaku Kato, shared with me his own experience of witnessing a blind woman's healing. Dr. Kato is president of Shalom University in the Democratic Republic of Congo, and we were meeting to discuss other issues for which we shared a passion, such as ethnic reconciliation. But because I was then writing my first book on miracles, I asked him if he had any eyewitness accounts from Congo. His denomination there was affiliated with a Western denomination that is not known for emphasizing miracles. Nevertheless, he did have an interesting account to share. 16 years earlier, he and two of his friends had been sharing Christ in a village dominated by traditional African religious practices. Hearing their message, an older man urged them to pray for his wife. He noted that neither traditional practices nor Western medicine had helped her blindness. "But Jesus is more powerful than a witch doctor," he confessed. Kato and his friends exchanged glances uncomfortably. None of them had ever prayed for something like this before. After they discussed the matter briefly, however, they decided that this was an opportunity. They had come so that Jesus would be honored, so they began to pray that he would honor his name by healing this woman. They had been praying for about 2 minutes when the woman began shouting, "I can see! I can see!" Although she was in her early 60s, she began dancing around while Kato and his friends looked on, amazed. She continued to be able to see for the rest of her life. I happened to be recounting Kato's story during my plenary address on miracles for the Institute of Biblical Research in 2014, when Dr. Kato unexpectedly walked in with another scholar. He was able to confirm the account to anyone there who asked him. When I wrote my first miracles book, I was teaching at an interdenominational but predominantly Baptist seminary near Philadelphia. Yolanda McCain, an American student from the seminary, visited an international student from the seminary, Paul Mokake, in Cameroon in summer 2006. While there, she was shocked to witness a blind man's sight restored during an exorcism of what purported to be a spirit partly controlling his nervous system. I now teach at an interdenominational but predominantly Wesleyan and Methodist seminary in Kentucky. One of my students there, Ethan Lindemuth, reported that in March 2017 he was visiting Zambia with some friends, talking and praying with people in villages. In response to a movie they had seen about miracles, Ethan and one of his friends started discussing why they never saw any miracles. As they were expressing their skepticism, a woman came around the corner and called them to follow her. She led them to an old woman who requested prayer because she was blind. Ethan recounts what happened after this. Her eyes did look quite dead, so my friend and I prayed for her, and we asked if anything had happened, to which they translated no. So I thought, well, okay, time to go to lunch. But then my friend urged us to pray again. So we did. Then when we asked if there was improvement, they said, yes, to our surprise. So we prayed again, and they exclaimed, she can see. I looked in her eyes, and they were whole, full of life. Still in disbelief, I asked, what color is my shirt? She answered, green. My friend asked, how many fingers am I holding up? To which she said, 3. Ironically, while the people who prayed for her still had some disbelief, the others were rejoicing over what God had done. Missionary Shelley Hollis shared with me that she was preaching in a Mozambican village where there were no Christians. A commotion started in the back of the crowd while she was preaching, but she continued preaching until she discovered that a teenage girl had started to hear for the first time. The girl's mother brought her forward and began to testify that her daughter had begun to hear. While they were testifying, the blind right eye of a woman to Shelley's left was suddenly healed. Shelley announced that God was healing people and instructed her listeners to bring the sick. In response, they brought a paralyzed woman on a mat. The woman then got up and began to dance. None of these people, Shelley emphasized, were yet Christians, although before the night was over, some 500 people committed themselves to become followers of Christ, and a church was started the next day. Bruce Collins is a leader in an international interdenominational renewal group called New Wine, which was originally based in the Anglican Church. He told me of a young orphan in western Kenya where his group cares for orphans. The boy was perhaps 90% blind. He needed to be led around and was unable to see even fingers held up in front of his face. After about 10 minutes of prayer, the boy could count all 10 fingers even 10 meters away. After 10 more minutes, he could see them 30 meters away. Bruce witnessed the healing himself, and when he returned to the orphanage that evening, he nearly wept as he saw the boy playing football, soccer, for the first time. Outside Africa. Korean scholar Julie Ma reports that in 1975, she and some colleagues prayed for a woman in the Philippines named Kapeng Andaloy. Kapeng had previously experienced prayer for her long-term blindness and hearing problems, with no effect, and kept declaring, "There is no God." Finally, however, she allowed prayer again, and this time she was instantly healed of all the conditions. After this, Kapeng and many others in the village became Christians. Such accounts are not limited to Africa or Asia. The following chapter recounts medically documented cases from Europe and North America. Also, my friend Randy Clark, who has his doctorate of ministry from United Theological Seminary and has taught there in the Doctor of Ministry track in Christian healing, recounts hearing from a pastor in Goiânia, Brazil, after he took a ministry team there. Despite instructions to pray as quickly as possible for individuals because so many people were seeking prayer, one woman on Randy's team kept praying for 4 hours for a man blinded 50 years earlier by acid in his eyes. His eyes were white from about 1/8 of an inch thickness of scar tissue that covered the entire pupil and cornea. But while 6 people were healed of blindness that night, this man was not, and the next day the team returned to the U.S. Several days later, however, Randy received an excited call from the local pastor. On the 3rd morning after the prayer, the man suddenly awoke with brand new eyes and clear vision. The doctors at the hospital kept asking him how this had happened, and the pastor said this was the greatest miracle in the history of our city. Another disappearance of scar tissue, but one that I do not elaborate on here because it does not deal with eyes and because it was so widely publicized in earlier years, involves the well-known healing of Dwayne Miller's destroyed vocal cord nerves while he was reading Psalm 103, verse 3, "God heals all your diseases." Miller told me that his non-Christian Jewish doctor regarded the disappearance of the scar tissue as inexplicable apart from a miracle. In a recent book, charismatic Catholic Bob Canton shares letters he has received from people for whom he has prayed who experienced healing, in many cases of their eyesight. Tanya Michelle Avendano from Oregon testifies that she was born blind in her left eye, but could see from it after prayer. "The world looks different for me now that I can see with both eyes." For 6 years, Tina Salome could not see well enough to recognize her priest apart from his voice, but after prayer, she could see a stop sign 100 yards away. Assemblies of God minister Bill Kirsch is a close friend of mine from my time in seminary. Bill shared with me the testimony he had grown up hearing of his mother's healing, and his mother, Alice, graciously shared her account with me. When Alice was about 12 years old, the eye doctor warned that her progressively deteriorating eyesight would lead to blindness. About 4 years later, she had trouble seeing even with her thick glasses. When a guest evangelist was praying for the sick during a service in Zion, Illinois, Alice got up to follow others forward for prayer. As she was descending the stairs from the balcony, however, she thought, "It is God who heals, not this minister." Nevertheless, she went forward, but when the minister laid a hand on her head, he declared, "I do not need to pray for you. God has already healed your eyes." Yet, as she made her way home, it was obvious to her that her eyesight was no better. The next morning when she got up and donned her thick glasses, however, everything was a blur. So she took them off and realized that she could see perfectly without them. She had, in fact, been healed. Cataracts disappear. I mentioned earlier that in some cases witnesses report cataracts vanishing, something that does not occur naturally without medical intervention. One of these accounts is from my friend Tom Parrish, a Methodist district superintendent. He was visiting a Pentecostal friend, Johanna Masinga, who was ministering in a rural area of Tanzania at the time. Others brought forward a man with a cane whose eyes were white. Masinga paused for a few extra moments to pray for this man, and then went on praying for others, until a sudden commotion erupted. The man who had been blind started shouting in his language and running around. As he passed by Tom, he stopped momentarily. Tom, being white, stood out. Tom did not understand the local language, but he did not have to wait for his friends to translate what the man was shouting about. The man's eyes were no longer white, but looked completely normal. Likewise, a Filipino seminarian, Chester Allen Tesoro, visited a church on the island of Mindanao that was pastored by a friend, where many miracles were being reported. Tesoro told me that he had noticed an older woman whose eyes were completely white. After the service, he suddenly heard her shouting, "I can see! I can see!" Initially, she could only see light, but then she began to see color. Tesoro was able to get close enough to recognize that her eyes were no longer white, but brown. Flint McLaughlin, Director of Enterprise Research at Cambridge's Transforming Business Project, shared with me his experience of praying in northern India for a blind man with clouded eyes. Robin Shields, who was also present, separately confirmed Flint's report of what happened next, as well as sharing photographs with me. As the man received sight, he shouted joyfully and ran in circles. The photographs communicate his joy far better than my description could. Later, however, he began to weep as he saw children, and Robin asked why. "Because I've always heard the children's voices," he responded, "but I had never seen their faces." The healing led to both this man and many others becoming followers of Jesus. Iris Ministries co-founder Heidi Baker notes the first time when she saw totally blind eyes, white from cataracts, change color and become normal and healthy. In a 2012 interview with John Lathrop for the Pneuma Review, Baker also spoke of a blind girl named Albertina in the village of Mieze. Albertina was about 20 months old, and her eyes were completely white. In front of both local villagers and foreign visitors, Albertina's eyes turned from white to gray and finally to beautiful dark brown. We sobbed as we watched her actually see her mother for the first time. Don Cantel, who worked with Roland and Heidi Baker's ministry and wrote his dissertation about it, told me, "I've seen blind eyes opened." He recounts an example of this in an essay he wrote on development aid. "I was 2 feet from a blind man and watched his milky pupils change to a solid color. He could suddenly see clearly." While some of these cases occurred too long ago or too far away for investigators like me to obtain medical documentation, other cases do have robust medical documentation. Chapter 17. Do blind people still receive sight? Doctors. I begin this chapter with an account from a medical journal of a woman whose 12 years of blindness ended with a desperate prayer. I turn then to another woman whose 12 years of blindness ended with a minister's command of faith. After noting the unexpected outcome of a media investigation in Denmark, I recount briefly the healing of stroke-induced blindness over the course of 4 successive prayers, and the healing of blindness caused by macular degeneration during a prayer seeking mental purity. Other accounts follow. After 12 years of blindness. A medical journal recently published a case study of blindness healed during prayer. I condense here the experience recounted there by Clarissa Romez and her colleagues. In 1959, at the age of 18, Patience, not her real name, suddenly lost vision in her left eye over a 2 or 3 day period. About 3 months later, she experienced the same loss in her right eye. Examination revealed that her sight was now 7/200, less than 20/400 in each eye, and evidence of organic macular degeneration rules out a purely psychosomatic or psychogenic explanation. The fundus exam showed a dense yellowish-white area of atrophy in each fovea associated with a central scotoma in both eyes. Doctors concluded that Patience had experienced a severe case of juvenile macular degeneration, a condition that even today is not medically curable. This condition persisted over the following decade. An examination on January 29, 1971, noted that even with correction, Patience's right eye's vision could be slightly improved to only 2400. Lateral deviation in her eyes was consistent with adult loss of vision, so she was enrolled for 3 months in training for the blind, including in reading Braille. One evening in August 1972, Patience and her husband, who were members of a Baptist church, were praying together before retiring for bed. Although they knew about miracles in the Bible, they were not familiar with anyone who had experienced dramatic healing in their circle of acquaintances. Overwhelmed by the Spirit, however, Patience's husband cried out while touching his wife, "Oh God, you can restore eyesight tonight, Lord. I know you can do it, and I pray you will do it." Immediately, as Patience opened her eyes, She could see for the first time in nearly 13 years. The next medical documentation comes later, in June 1974. Examinations revealed that patients' sight was now 2,100 in each eye, an increase of more than 400%. In 2001, when patients prepared to get new glasses, her eyesight with correction was 20/40 in each eye. Another exam in 2013 found the same. The only problems in her eyes were those normal for a woman of her age, 72. To date, Romez notes, her eyesight has remained intact for 47 years with only common age-related eye problems since the healing. The article weighs various proposed explanations, finding most of them unsuitable, and concludes with patients' own perspective. What people need to understand is I was blind, totally blind, and attended the school for the blind. I read Braille and walked with a white cane. Never had I seen my husband or daughter's face. I was blind when my husband prayed for me. Then, just like that, in a moment, after years of darkness, I could see perfectly. It was miraculous. My daughter's picture was on the dresser. I could see what my little girl and husband looked like. I could see the floor, the steps. A retired white cane. Although there is nothing special about 12 years per se, despite Mark chapter 5 verses 25 and 42, Patience's is not the only recent case of blindness healed after 12 years. Andrea Anderson of Sarnia, Ontario, has experienced many health problems throughout her life. One of them was sudden onset blindness in both eyes, less than 2 weeks apart, a complication of her diabetes and the strokes it led to. She remained blind for 12 years. On Pentecost Sunday morning, May 15, 2016, Anderson was weeping and praying for a health need for her baby great-granddaughter. Yet she also felt unworthy to pray. Like many other people who have been molested in childhood, she carried a false feeling of guilt. "How can you love me?" she cried to God. Anderson normally did not attend an evening church service, but she felt compelled to attend the service that night at her home congregation, Bethel Pentecostal Church. A visiting West Virginia evangelist named Ted Shuttlesworth was speaking. He did not know her, but he felt led to stop and pray for her. Led by the Lord, he began listing some of the sicknesses she had experienced. The church's video captured his fervent command, "You blinded spirit, I command you to go." Then he instructed her, "Turn around and look at me." "Well, I can turn around," she reasoned, "but I can't look." When she turned, however, she suddenly could see him, and she began weeping for joy. "If it weren't my own teeth in my mouth," she told me, "I would have dropped them." The evangelist led her to the front of the church. Demonstrating her newfound sight, she proceeded to follow all his unspoken motions. As members of her congregation, people who knew how blind she had been began cheering for God. As important as this healing was, Anderson tells me that God did another special miracle for her that day. After her healing, Ted Shuttlesworth bent over and announced another message. "God also told me to tell you, He loves you, and it was not your fault." Because of the abuse she had experienced in the past, she had struggled with being afraid of God. But God's love touched her deeply at that moment, and now she delights in the love of her Heavenly Father. When she returned to her eye doctor, he was naturally astonished. "I'm scientific. I don't know what to say." Again, science as science is about measurements and data, so he followed appropriate procedures. He examined all his earlier reports, scheduled various tests, and consulted another doctor. The next time he saw her, he announced that he had been telling others about her story. "This is unbelievable," he noted, "but I have to believe it." The next time she saw her pastor, Tim Gibb, was in the church lobby, and he celebrated her healing by probing playfully, "How do I look?" "You're gorgeous," she replied. His then 19-year-old son, Caden, was walking by. "Andrea says I'm gorgeous," Pastor Gibb declared. "You better pray for her again," Caden teased. Anderson continues to see, and Pastor Gibb keeps her old white cane in his office as a reminder of what God has done. "I have known Andrea for years," he told me. "The miracle that happened that night for her was obvious to all who knew her." The backfired exposé. Danish journalist Henry Nissen reports how TV2 in Denmark secretly recruited Roger Peterson, a non-churchgoer who had chronically impaired vision, to test a visiting Nigerian-born evangelist's ability to heal. Many people in the meeting appeared to be experiencing healing, but producer Thomas Breinholt and his team reasoned that perhaps the evangelist had planted actors merely to pretend healing. The evangelist didn't notice or pray for Peterson, their own plant, who was sitting in the back. But when Peterson responded to the call to accept Christ, he found himself healed. When Peterson went up to thank the evangelist, the latter advised him to thank Jesus instead. The station did not get the story they expected, but they certainly got a story. Nissen reproduces in the book Peterson's eye charts confirming his healing. Blinded by a stroke. Kent Gross from Albany, Oregon, was legally blind from a stroke for 4 years. The state provided him a legal subsidy because of his disability, and his eye examination from February 21, 2019, clearly states that he is legally blind. In July 2019, Lee Schnabel spoke at Gross's church, Valley Christian Center, and Schnabel and his colleagues prayed with Gross for the restoration of his sight. His sight improved somewhat after the first prayer, so they prayed again. This was repeated for a total of 4 times of prayer, and when they finished, Gross's sight was fully restored. His ophthalmologist was surprised by his newfound sight and had to confirm the records with the chief ophthalmologist in the office. Gross then shared with his ophthalmologist that he had been healed during prayer. Gross's September 13, 2019 eye exam shows that he is no longer legally blind, and Gross no longer receives a subsidy for his blindness. He now works for a nonprofit in Eugene, Oregon that serves disabled persons. Before, at work, Gross would always have to make sure that people sent him material that could be read aloud to him. His healing made such a difference at work that he no longer needed help, and he advanced to operations manager. At church, he could see all the people that he had been able only to hear formerly. He no longer needed his white cane in public. He had more confidence and far more independence. He could read stories to his grandchildren. His church's way of thinking has also been revolutionized because now people are more open to the reality of healing, not just internationally, but even in the U.S. This healing of blindness also fits a larger pattern of healings in Lee Schnabel's ministry. Nor are such healings limited to a single ministry. For example, after submitting the first draft of this book, I learned of another eye healing after a stroke from Methodist pastor Carolyn Moore. Unaware that I was working on a new book on miracles, she mentioned in passing a healing about which I inquired further. When she was doing ministry in Seattle on March 16, 2019, Cheryl Scroggins experienced a deep touch from the Holy Spirit. A stroke roughly half a year earlier, on September 27, 2018, had affected her right side, including blinding her right eye. Her vision had never improved, and the doctor warned her that it would never come back. When Scroggins awoke the morning of Sunday, March 17th, however, I opened my eyes and immediately could see clearly from my affected eye. Her husband tested her sight in various ways for an hour to make sure the healing was genuine, and that morning she shared the experience in church. The church, knowing her prior vision impairment, celebrated with her. The memo from her next appointment on April 18th says it all. Absolutely unbelievable, miraculous, full recovery from her CVA. Macular degeneration undegenerates. During his 15 years in law enforcement focused on narcotics, Greg Spencer was exposed to heavy violence. As a deputy medical examiner as well, he witnessed the bodies of many who had died in road accidents or had been murdered. Hardened on the outside, he was nevertheless deeply disturbed by what he had seen. Eventually, Spencer left his job in law enforcement and began driving trucks cross-country, but this new career lasted only about 6 months. His vision began to decline, and medical professionals diagnosed him with macular degeneration, a condition that is irreversible. Tests included mapping the structure of his eyes and revealed a form of permanent mottling in the center of his vision. His vision quickly declined from normal vision to 2200 in one eye and 2400 in the other. He was legally blind. Placed on disability, he went through the full training for blindness with the Oregon Commission for the Blind, never expecting to see again. Soon after this, Spencer met a believer named Wendy, who helped him come to faith in Christ and also became his wife. Still troubled by memories of the awful scenes he had witnessed earlier, he attended a church retreat focused on the healing of his mind. While he was praying for the healing of his mind, he felt that God said, "You are clean." When Spencer opened his eyes, he discovered that God had restored not only his mind, but also his vision. 2 witnesses who were present confirm what happened to Spencer next. He rushed outside to learn whether he could really see fully. One of the witnesses, Randy Webb, recounts that Spencer announced to him, "Randy, I've been healed." "What?" Webb asked. I can see! Webb pointed to some blackbirds barely visible in the distance. "Can you see those birds out there?" he queried. "Yeah, I can see those birds." Then Spencer began looking around everywhere and describing all the other things that he could now see. He found that he could read license plates in the distance that even his friends could not read. The rest of the weekend he went around reading license plates to celebrate that he could. On the way home from the retreat, he kept pointing out, "I can see that." Yet to Spencer, the greatest part of the miracle was the healing of his mind. Unfortunately for books like this one, when people experience healing, they usually celebrate without collecting any documentation for their experience. Spencer did not have that luxury, however, because he now needed to get off disability, and the Social Security Administration could not accept an undocumented claim that macular degeneration had simply disappeared. That was not supposed to happen. Perhaps he had simply faked blindness earlier. A number of professionals carefully examined him, however, and the documentation is clear. Before his experience, he was legally blind, but afterward he could see. For some of the documentation, see Joel Lance's Bridges for Honest Skeptics, from which I have the information about the witnesses of Spencer's healing. More than 3 years after Spencer's diagnosis of 2400 vision, the same specialist confirmed that he had experienced a remarkable return of his visual acuity, which was now measured at 20/30. Although 20/30 vision is not quite 20/20 vision, it is far better than my own vision. After finishing its investigation, the Social Security Administration acknowledged that Spencer's eyesight was no longer impaired, that he had been blind, but now he could see, as in John chapter 9, verse 25. 18 years after his healing, now at age 61, Spencer's sight remains normal for his age. Of course, everything has a downside. When your benefits stop, you have to go back to work. Other cases. Medical doctor Nonyem Numbere recounts stories from her husband Jeffrey's ministry, including numerous miracles that took place. In one case in May 1973, Jeffrey prayed for a 5 or 6-year-old girl who had been born blind. Her eyes looked like empty sockets with skin draped over them. She and a blind boy were both healed, leading to the conversion of much of the Nigerian village of Dere. One could offer many more examples of healings of blindness. An industrial accident left George Orr nearly blind in one eye as a result of irreparable corneal scarring. The state of Pennsylvania, therefore, provided him with workers' compensation for losing his eye. 2 decades later, however, as he listened to a sermon about healing, Orr's eyesight was suddenly healed. The optometrist certified that the scar tissue had disappeared. Earlier in Chapter 12, I included a doctor's published account of a medical trainee healed of a deadly condition, including of the eye scarring that it had caused. The doctor also notes the case of a school teacher blinded by an accident, but healed so thoroughly that he did not even need glasses after his healing. René Poirier was an electrician for a 3,000-employee computer facility in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. At about 9 a.m. on October 9, 1990, the power went down at the facility. While the power was off, Poirier was asked to hook up some wires. As he did so, a fireball exploded, hurling him 15 feet back into a concrete wall. After he regained consciousness, he could not focus with his eyes. There are some scratches and burns on the cornea, the doctor noted, but he did not expect the effects to be serious. The doctor considered Poirier fortunate to have survived with minimal bruises. The optimism, however, proved premature. For more than 9 years, Poirier was blind, yet he learned how to help others as a physical therapist. In his blindness, he experienced God's grace more deeply. Then, on May 23, 2000, as he was starting work at Sacred Heart Hospital, the most brilliant light that he had seen since the accident flooded his eyes. Was he having a stroke, he wondered? But he could see the cross atop the chapel's roof, and then the trees. Realizing that he could see, he rushed into the chapel, prostrating himself before the altar and crying out his gratitude to God. He shared his experience immediately with Father Edmund Klimek, the chaplain, who had been supportive all along. Now Poirier could actually see the flowers, his co-workers, and the world. He could even read fine print. His supportive boss wouldn't let him stay at work that day. There must be something in the employee handbook about getting the day off if a miracle occurs. That day, Poirier saw his children for the first time in 10 years. After putting them to bed with prayer and some Bible verses, he relished the chance to go through photos and catch up on all the family sights he had been missing. Poirier's testimony appeared on 2020, The Oprah Winfrey Show, The Today Show, Larry King Live, CNN, and PAX TV's It's a Miracle. Other explanations? Of course, what a believer calls a miracle, a non-believer will explain differently. In a 1997 article in Journal of Religion and Health, Paul Parker reports, "When my younger sister was 3 years old, she walked accidentally into the sword-shaped leaf of a Spanish bayonet yucca plant and punctured one of her eyes. It deflated like a beach ball. The attending physician pronounced her blind and offered what treatment he could. My parents prayed and asked the church to pray. In several weeks, my sister could see again. The church and my family praised God for a miracle. The physician sheepishly objected that he had misdiagnosed the injury, and the eye had healed quite naturally. Misdiagnosis occurs, but many of us would agree with Parker that in many cases, such as this one, a simpler explanation lies close at hand. Chapter 18. Do Disabled People Still Walk? Reflex Sympathetic Dystrophy. Neither Emma McKinley, the primary subject of this chapter, nor Marlene Kleps, the subject of the next chapter, was expected to ever walk again. Their conditions were not limited to inability to walk. Under normal circumstances, both cases would have been physically hopeless, and the second case would have been terminal. But let's start briefly with another case of the same condition that affected Emma McKinley. On December 24, 1993, 14-year-old Patricia Zemba was injured while horseback riding near Phoenix, Arizona. Soon after this, Dr. Marilyn Wells testifies, Patricia developed the most serious case of reflex sympathetic dystrophy, RSD, that Dr. Wells had ever witnessed. Although Patricia's parents prayed for her recovery for weeks, a doctor suggested that they would need to institutionalize her. Doctors planned to implant a morphine pump, as they would for terminally ill patients, but the night before her scheduled surgery, on March 11, 1994, the family's prayers were answered in a stunning way. As Patricia was praying, the pain began to leave her body. A voice said, "Get up." Not surprisingly, she was afraid to believe or try to move, so she said, "God, if that's really you, please give me more confirmation." Then the voice came even more authoritatively, "Get up." The thought seemed impossible to her. She had not walked or even sat up for over 3 months. But she tried to obey, and when her feet touched the hospital floor, she had no pain. For a moment, she stood transfixed in place. Could this really be happening? Then she walked down the hall. The night shift nurse, knowing that Patricia was unable to walk, rushed over to her, warning that she should not be out of bed. But Patricia was now convinced that God had performed a miracle, and at 4 a.m. she started calling family and doctors, "God has healed me." Comparing Patricia's x-rays before and after her healing, Dr. Wells could not find any remaining traces of the source of her condition. Dr. Wells was unaware of any other sudden, spontaneous remissions of RSD in history. When she was interviewed 5 years later, Patricia reported no recurrence of the symptoms. But she was young and had suffered from RSD only for a few months. What might happen to someone much older who had suffered from it for years? Emma McKinley's Christmas Eve surprise. A potentially fatal work accident in April 1993 left Emma McKinley with a concussion, significant hearing loss, and RSD. By January 1995, her disability grew even more severe, and the decline continued that year. Her left hand began to claw in November, and Christmas Eve 1995 was her final complete meal with solid food. She was confined to a wheelchair by February 1996, a wheelchair in which she spent the next 15 years, all day, every day. Because the top of her body twisted to the left and her head lay far to one side, builders had to expand her home's doors for her to pass through them. Even getting her into the transport van was difficult. She required many medicines and depended entirely on fluid intake. Because of pain, she was sometimes awake for nearly 3 days at a time, until exhaustion put her body to sleep. In 2011, early in the morning of Christmas Eve, Emma was alone in her home when she had another accident. Her wheelchair tipped over, leaving her twisted and in torment on the floor. She describes her agony. Pain exploded when the curve of my neck slammed the floor, crushing it against the bed. Fire shot through my spine. My crooked foot got pinned somewhere behind my right leg, and my left arm lay trapped beneath me. All I could see of it was my big club fist, looking lifeless and useless in front of my face. The slightest attempt to move only spiked the pain. She realized that she might soon die in this position. She could not reach the phone. The only person who could possibly hear or help her was Jesus. For more than 8 hours, she could do nothing but keep screaming his name through her parched throat. Suddenly, she heard a roaring wind and felt a bright presence. As her room lit up with brilliance, she saw a glowing robe and wondered whether she was entering another dimension. Jesus' face was too bright to stare into, but his power surged through her. She heard bones crack as he straightened her permanently bent left foot, pinned beneath her. Then he began opening her hand that had been clenched for over 16 years. The flesh was raw and red, full of sores, but in front of her eyes, the flesh healed, and she had the ability to move her own fingers. Finally, he healed her neck and spine, then invited her to take his hands. His presence mattered more than anything, but as she took his hands, he set her on her feet. Her muscles had atrophied, but it was clear that Jesus now wanted her to walk. So, though wobbly and sore, she began to do so. After the basic tutorial in walking, the sound of the wind and the brightness of Jesus' presence vanished. Nevertheless, Emma began experimenting joyfully with how her body now worked. Surprises continue. Emma's sons and grandsons were due to visit that evening. Though still wobbly and practicing coordination, she lit candles herself, laughing gleefully. When the doorbell rang and her family entered, they were stunned to see an empty wheelchair. Before anyone could panic, she walked into the room. Her son Jason looked up and then looked again, frozen. Everybody's mouth dropped open. "Are you serious?" Jason exclaimed. He stepped toward her hesitantly. "Mom?" "Come here," she ordered, and they embraced and broke into laughter together. She turned to her younger son, Jeff, now white-faced and too dumbfounded to speak, and embraced him as well. Finally, she turned to her grandsons, who had never seen her walk or be physically upright before. Young Connor grasped her tenaciously, but 15-year-old Brady held back. "Grandma, I'm kind of freaking out right now." She hugged him. "It's okay, honey," she comforted him. "I think we're all freaking out right now." Connor marveled at the new, smooth skin on his grandmother's hands, though Emma still had some pain in her hands, feet, and back. Although she would continue to use some pain medication, her upper body was now straight instead of bent nearly 90 degrees to the side. Emma was not done with playful surprises. Soon after Christmas, on January 4th, 2012, she surprised Dr. David Bell. Transfixed with astonishment, he gasped, "Please tell me Emma has a twin." As Emma recounted her experience, he hung on every word, celebrating with her. A few weeks later, she visited her RSD specialist, Keith Bankston. He had already heard the news, but still expressed astonishment at how wonderful she looked. He was particularly amazed to learn that the restoration had been instantaneous. When, on Valentine's Day, a nurse explained to Dr. Amindra Arora, Emma's gastroenterologist, that Emma was in an examination room, he protested. "She couldn't be in there. She doesn't fit through the door." As he entered the room, he stood motionless, his eyes wide and his mouth open. He stared from her face to her feet and back. What happened? What did you do?" he cried. "You know that crooked spine and the hand that wouldn't open? And the crooked foot?" Yeah, I know. What did you do?" He was amazed and grateful to hear the story. And the surprises went on, including surprises for Emma. In 2012, local news in Rochester, Minnesota, covered her well-documented story. Emma's book includes photographs of her severe condition before her healing, including her frozen left hand and the infected leg covered with RSD sores that was nearly amputated. It also includes photos she captured when she surprised her stunned doctors and nurses by walking up to them, healed. A medical report from several months after the healing notes her extraordinary recovery on Christmas Eve in connection with an experience she attributes to seeing and feeling God.